Okay, hi there, and welcome to this knowledge tutorial. It's looking at the evacuation route. There is a link here, and I'll put the link on the description to a worksheet I've done with regards to this. So we'll get started, and really the aim of this presentation is to look at the evacuation route, how it worked, and as you can see here we have our different stages of this. We'll go through each one in turn. Key thing to remember, the aim was to get the wounded removed from the battlefield as soon as possible. It was not a process that every wounded soldier would go all the way through. So if you were lightly wounded, yeah, you might be picked up by a stretcher bearer, you might get to the regimental aid post, but you might get just patched up there and you could be fine. Or you might go to a dressing station. You might not be as bad as to need to go all the way through the base hospitals. And unfortunately, for some wounded, if they were mortally wounded, they wouldn't get here. They might be left at a dressing station or a casualty clearing station through triage and left to pass away peacefully. So let's move on and we'll have a look. Yep, that's you can see there. It's probably a training. A training image here, because obviously we're looking from above, which is a little bit suspect. That guy's bandage there is a little bit too clean. And if you notice, the guy here is looking awfully well for somebody wounded, and there's not a lot of barbed wire or defensive features. So this is suggesting to me that it's likely a staged photo. How effective was the evacuation route? Well, the effectiveness didn't get better over time consistently throughout the war. It improved over the course of the war, but didn't always function brilliantly. For example, in the Battle of the Somme, large numbers of casualties overloaded the system. So while we do see improvements over time, it wasn't a guarantee. Large numbers of casualties and events such as during the Battle of Passchendaele, the environmental conditions did exacerbate the movement of wounded through the evacuation route. So a big development was, however, the decision to keep treatment in France. At the beginning of the war, the focus was on assuming that the wounded would be treated in Britain, but later on in the war, the demands to get soldiers returning into the trenches meant the evacuation route allowed more men to be returned far quicker than previously, and it's assumed around about 67%, or nearly 2/3 of the wounded, returned to the trenches following their initial wounds. It can be seen to improve in a number of other areas. The development of technology, the use of motor ambulances, the greater use of transport. So it wasn't just ambulances. They developed ambulance trains. There were 4 in 1914, there were 28 in 1916, and also barges as well, because these were a lot slower, yes, but they were a lot more gentler on moving the wounded, and you could move the wounded back a lot more easily. With barges, a lot greater numbers, and the trains could then be developed to bring soldiers to the front line along with extra supplies. And the Battle of Arras showed the route illustrated effective planning and management of the wounded. So during the Battle of Arras, we do see a development of the evacuation route, not to its kind of pinnacle, but certainly a big improvement. So past paper question type 1. It's usually kind of 2 key features. So if it's 2 key features of the evacuation route, remember it's make a point, 1 key feature was, and then the evidence, this was when. Another key feature was, and this was when, or evidence this can be seen by. And I'll put a link on as well to this practice question here. So stage 1, stretcher bearers, typically 16 per battalion, which was roughly between 600 up to 1,000 men, but typically no more than about 600 in the trenches. Stretcher bearers, 4 people to carry a stretcher. You might need even more, up to 8 in the muddy conditions, like the Third Battle of Ypres, or Passchendaele as it was also known. And the stretcher bearers, as well as being stretcher bearers themselves, would often carry extra bandages and sometimes even things like morphine for the pain. There's a BBC video which looks at a stretcher bearer's kit, and that person also has a form of a tourniquet to stop the bleeding of a traumatic injury. So stretcher bearers, yep, they are moving the wounded, but they would also, to a degree, stabilize the wounded before they took them to the next area, which was the regimental aid post. And this was often close to the front line or the firing line trench just behind it. And the RAP, the regimental aid post, had its medical officer and approximately 30 orderlies, and that would be for the entire battalion of around about 600 men. And their job was really, really simple. It was to decide who was lightly wounded and who needed to be passed down the line and carried on. They would be typically in a dugout, sometimes in a ruined building. This wasn't about providing a huge amount of medical treatment. It was simply about making a call as to who can stay, who can go. And if you were moved on, you went to a field ambulance or a dressing station. Now, the idea of field ambulance, you're thinking of a vehicle. That's not the case. It was a mobile medical unit, and their job was to run a triage. Now, I've checked with the exam board. Dressing stations, or field ambulance dressing stations, and the casualty clearing stations, both triaged. It was kind of could be done by both. Triage means you decide who's lightly wounded, who can stay there, who's more seriously wounded, move up the line, who's got a mortal wound, who's not going to survive. And you're able to kind of start to categorize the wounded rather than just having everyone en masse move on to the next area. Serious cases go to casualty clearing stations, and they would go either through motorized, ambulance or horse-drawn. There are doctors, orderlies, and after 1915 you start to see nurses appear in the field ambulance and dressing stations. In the casualty clearing stations, it was a well-equipped facility. It would typically be about 12 miles behind the front line. They would typically undertake operations, including amputations. They had lots of equipment. Things like the X-ray machines were there. They also had operating theatres, room for about 50 wounded, and room for the staff with them. It wasn't a particularly big facility, but it was designed to be able to kind of get people to where they needed to be, keep that process, that evacuation route going, and look after some and stabilise those that had the greatest wounds. And the final stage of this was the base hospital, a general or a stationary hospital. And wounded were brought in by ambulance lorries, by train, and even canal barges, which we've talked about earlier. And these were huge. You can see the size of this particular structure here, 2,500 wounded, and you think that you've also got to need the staffing for that. And some of them would take on specialist wards for things such as gas poisonings, burns, and if you were severely wounded, you'd then get shipped back to England with the famous Blighty wound, that wound that would mean you're out of the war. Okay, so that's the situation. You've gone through each of the stages. You can see the process. Remember, the wounded wouldn't go all the way through every process. It depended upon the severity of the wound. Hope this has been useful. Thank you for listening, and any problems, please feel free to comment. Thank you and goodbye.